You're making a mistake, and you don't even realize it. You think being a good person means being open, available, and always willing to help. You believe that if you show enough kindness, people will naturally respect you for it. But the truth is, the more predictable you become, the easier it is for someone to use you without you noticing. And the price you pay isn't obvious at first. It doesn't show up as a single moment of betrayal. It builds slowly. In small interactions you brush off, in favors you say yes to when you wanted to say no, in conversations where you reveal more than you should. At first, it feels harmless. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal. But over time, something shifts. People stop asking how you are. They stop checking in unless they need something. And without realizing it, you've moved from being valued to being expected. That's where the real danger begins. Because when people start expecting your time, your energy, and your help, they stop appreciating it. And here's the part most people completely miss. They didn't decide to use you overnight. They learned it. They learned it by watching how easily you respond, how quickly you give, how rarely you hold back. You train them, without meaning to, that you're always available, always willing, always there. And once that pattern is set, it becomes very hard to break. Because now, the moment you change, even slightly, it feels like you're the one doing something wrong. You hesitate to say no. You over-explain your boundaries. You feel guilty for protecting your own time. And that guilt is exactly what keeps you stuck. This is where most people lose control of the situation. Not because they're weak, but because they don't see the pattern clearly enough. They think the problem is the other person. But the real problem is deeper. It's in the signals you're sending without realizing it. Every time you respond instantly, you signal urgency. Every time you agree without question, you signal compliance. Every time you share too much, too soon, you give away leverage you didn't even know you had. And once someone understands your patterns, they don't need to manipulate you directly. They just position themselves in a way that triggers your automatic response. That's why it feels so subtle, so hard to detect. You don't feel controlled, you feel like you're choosing. But if you slow down and look closely, you'll notice something uncomfortable. The same types of situations keep repeating. The same kinds of people keep showing up. And the outcome is always the same. You give more than you receive. You invest more than they do. And somehow, you're the one left feeling drained, confused, and slightly off balance. That feeling is not random. It's a signal. But most people ignore it because they don't want to believe something so simple could be happening right in front of them. And that's exactly why it continues. Because the moment you don't question the pattern, you reinforce it. And the longer it goes on, the more natural it feels. Until one day, you don't even recognize that you've lost control of the dynamic entirely. Lucas didn't figure this out by reading books. He figured it out by watching patterns. The way people behave when they think you're always available. The way their tone shifts when they assume you'll say yes anyway. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Ethan started noticing something small at first. Messages that only came at convenient times, for them. Requests that always sounded urgent, but never important. Conversations that began friendly, but always led to a favor. And the strange part was, none of it felt aggressive. No one was forcing him. No one was being openly disrespectful. That's what made it so hard to detect. Because real manipulation doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like choice. You think you're helping because you want to. You think you're giving because it's the right thing to do. But if you pay attention, there's always a pattern behind it. For example, they rarely ask about your life unless it leads back to what they need. Or they compliment you right before asking for something. Not in an obvious way, just enough to lower your guard. And over time, your brain starts associating helping them with being appreciated. That's how the loop forms. You give, they respond just enough to keep you engaged, and then they take again. But here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. Most people think the solution is to become colder, more distant, less kind. But that's not it. That's just swinging to the other extreme. The real issue isn't your kindness. It's your lack of control over when and how you use it. And this is where everything shifts. Because once Ethan slowed down and started observing instead of reacting, he saw something uncomfortable. The same people who once seemed warm and friendly became slightly impatient when he didn't respond right away. The same people who used to thank him started acting like his help was expected. And that's when it clicked. Their behavior didn't change randomly. It adapted to his patterns. Which means if he changed his patterns, their behavior would change too. But here's the deeper layer most people never reach. When someone is using you subtly, they don't rely on force. They rely on your identity. They rely on you seeing yourself as the reliable one, the helpful one, the one who doesn't say no. Because the moment you attach yourself to that identity, you start protecting it. Even when it hurts you, you start saying yes just to stay consistent with who you think you are. And that's where control is lost completely. Because now, you're not responding to the situation. You're responding to an image of yourself. And that image can be used against you. That's why some people never break out of this cycle. Not because they can't see the signs, but because changing would feel like becoming someone else. But in reality, the opposite is true. You don't lose yourself by setting limits. You reveal who you really are. And once Ethan understood this, he stopped trying to please everyone. Not in an aggressive way. Not in a dramatic way. Just small shifts. Delayed responses. Shorter answers. Fewer explanations. And something interesting started to happen. Some people pulled away immediately. Others tried harder to get his attention. And a few adjusted and treated him with more respect. That reaction alone told him everything he needed to know. Because when you stop being easy to use, people show you exactly why they were there in the first place. And that's the moment where most people realize they were never in control of the dynamic to begin with. What Ethan began to understand next was something most people never fully see. It wasn't just about other people's behavior. It was about a deeper mechanism happening inside his own mind. Because every time he said yes when he meant no, something subtle was reinforced. Not just in others, but in himself. His brain was learning a pattern. Help equals approval. Giving equals being valued. And over time, that equation became automatic. That's how the cycle locks in. You don't consciously decide to be used. You condition yourself into it. And once that conditioning is strong enough, it runs in the background without you questioning it. That's why even when you start noticing something feels off, you still go along with it. You still respond. You still give. Because part of you believes that if you stop, something will be lost. Maybe the relationship. Maybe the connection. Maybe the image you've built of being someone people can rely on. But here's where the mechanism gets even more precise. Humans are wired to avoid social rejection. It's one of the strongest behavioral drivers. So when someone subtly withdraws attention, appreciation, or warmth, your brain reads it as a threat. Not a physical threat, but a social one. And your immediate instinct is to fix it, to restore balance, to get back to that feeling of being accepted. That's why when someone you've been helping suddenly becomes distant, you feel an urge to do more, not less. You reach out first. You offer help again. You try to earn back something that was never supposed to be conditional in the first place. And this is exactly where control is taken from you. Not through force, but through your own internal response system. But here's the part that changes everything. Once you see this mechanism clearly, you realize something uncomfortable. The person using you doesn't need to plan anything. They don't need a strategy. They just respond to what you consistently allow. And your behavior teaches them where the line is. Or in most cases, that there is no line at all. And once there's no line, there's no resistance. And once there's no resistance, there's no reason for them to stop. This is why the same pattern repeats across different people, different situations, even different stages of life. It's not about who they are. It's about what you signal. And the signals are often invisible to you. The speed of your response. The way you prioritize others over yourself. The way you explain your decisions as if you need permission to have boundaries. All of these create a psychological profile that others can read instantly, even if they're not aware of it consciously. But here's the twist most people never consider. You don't lose control in one moment. You lose it gradually. Each time you override your own hesitation. Each time you ignore that quiet feeling telling you something isn't right. Each time you choose short-term harmony over long-term respect. And eventually, that quiet feeling disappears altogether. Not because the situation improved, but because you stopped listening to it. That's when the pattern becomes invisible again. And that's why so many people stay stuck in it for years. Because the system feels normal, familiar, even safe. But underneath it, you're slowly giving away control of your time, your energy, and your position in the relationship. And the longer it continues, the harder it becomes to see where it actually started. 1 week later, Ethan thought he had things under control. He told himself he would be more aware, more careful, less reactive. But real life doesn't test you with obvious situations. It tests you with the same patterns, just slightly disguised. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. He was working, focused, finally getting ahead on something important. Then his phone buzzed. A message from someone he hadn't heard from in a while. "Hey man, quick question." That phrase alone should have triggered something. But it didn't. Not yet. The message felt casual, friendly, safe. Ethan replied. Within seconds. And just like that, the pattern restarted. The quick question turned into a small request. The small request turned into, "Can you just take a look at this?" And before he realized it, he was spending 30 minutes solving a problem that wasn't his. Again, nothing about it felt aggressive. There was no pressure, no demand, but there was something subtle underneath it. The timing, the tone, the assumption that he would help. And the moment he finished, the conversation ended. No follow-up, no real interest in him, just silence. Later that evening, he thought about it. Something felt off. Not wrong enough to confront, but not right enough to ignore. And that's exactly where most people get stuck. In that gray zone, where you feel something, but you can't fully explain it. The next day, it happened again. Different person. Same pattern. A friendly check-in that slowly turned into a favor. This time, Ethan hesitated. Just for a moment. He didn't reply instantly. He waited. And that's when he noticed something new. The other person followed up. "Hey, did you see my message?" Not aggressive, but slightly more urgent. Slightly more expectant. That's when it became clear. The urgency wasn't real. It was created. And his immediate response in the past had reinforced it. Then came the third situation. This one was harder to ignore. A friend he'd helped many times before reached out again. Same tone. Same energy. But this time, Ethan did something different. He replied with a delay. Short. Neutral. No extra enthusiasm. No over-explaining. Just enough. And the reaction was instant. The tone changed. Less warm. Less patient. Almost confused. As if something was off. And in that moment, Ethan saw it clearly for the first time. The relationship had been built on a pattern, not genuine balance. Because the moment he stepped out of that pattern, the dynamic shifted. That's when Lucas said something that stayed with him. Watch what happens when you stop being predictable. That's when people show you their real position in your life. And once Ethan started watching, he saw it everywhere. People who only engaged when they needed something. People who disappeared when there was nothing to gain. People who were warm when receiving, but distant when giving. But the most uncomfortable part wasn't what they were doing. It was realizing how long he had allowed it. How many times he ignored that quiet signal. How often he chose to respond instead of observe. And how natural it had all felt. Until he slowed down enough to see it clearly. What Ethan did next wasn't dramatic. He didn't confront anyone. He didn't suddenly cut people off. That's what most people think taking control looks like, but that usually backfires. Because when you change too fast, too aggressively, it creates resistance. And resistance makes people push back harder. Instead, he made a much quieter shift. One that most people wouldn't even notice, but it changed everything. He stopped reacting instantly. That was the first move. Not ignoring, not avoiding, just delaying. Because when you respond immediately every time, you train people to expect it. You create a rhythm they can rely on. But the moment you break that rhythm, even slightly, you interrupt the pattern. And when the pattern is interrupted, people reveal their real intentions. Some become more polite, more patient. They adjust. Others become more demanding, more urgent. And a few disappear completely. That alone tells you more than anything. They could say. Then Ethan did something else. He stopped over-explaining. Before, every time he couldn't help, he felt the need to justify it. Long messages. Detailed reasons. Trying to make sure the other person understood he wasn't a bad person. But Lucas pointed out something important. The more you explain, the more it sounds like you're asking for permission. And when you ask for permission to set a boundary, you've already lost control of it. So Ethan shortened his responses. Clear. Simple. No emotional weight behind them. And something interesting happened. The people who respected him accepted it without issue. The ones who didn't started pushing, asking more questions, trying to pull him back into the old pattern. That push was the signal. Not their words, but their reaction to change. Because people who value you don't need you to prove your limits. They recognize them. Then came the hardest part. Saying no, without softening it. Not aggressively. Not cold. Just directly. And at first, it felt uncomfortable. Almost wrong. Like he was breaking some invisible rule. That's the conditioning talking. The same conditioning that kept him stuck before. But the more he did it, the more something shifted internally. That constant pressure to respond started fading. That urge to fix everything got quieter. And in its place, something new started forming. Awareness, space, control. But here's where most people misunderstand this entire process. They think the goal is to stop giving, to become distant, to protect everything. But that's not it. That's just another extreme. The real goal is much more precise. It's choosing when to give and when to hold back, based on what you see, not what you feel in the moment. Because feelings can be triggered, patterns can be exploited. But awareness, that's something you control. And once you start operating from that place, people can't predict you as easily anymore. They can't assume your response. They can't rely on your old patterns. And when that happens, the entire dynamic changes. But there's one part Ethan still hadn't fully mastered yet. Something even more subtle than boundaries. Something that determines whether people respect your limits or keep testing them. And most people never even realize it exists. What made that shift so effective was not the words Ethan used. It was the signal underneath them. Because every social dynamic runs on prediction. People are constantly reading patterns, often without realizing it. They notice how fast you reply, how easily you agree, how uncomfortable you get when there is tension. And once those patterns become clear, your behavior becomes easy to anticipate. That is where the imbalance begins. Not when someone asks for too much, but when they already know what your answer will be before you even think about it. The moment Ethan stopped reacting automatically, he introduced uncertainty. And uncertainty changes everything. When people can no longer predict your timing, your availability, or your emotional response, they lose the shortcut they were using to manage you. They can no longer lean on habit. They have to face you as you are now, not as the version of you they had grown comfortable using. That is why a delayed response matters more than most people think. It is not about playing games. It is about interrupting automatic access. The same is true when you stop over-explaining. Long explanations do not create respect. They often reveal discomfort. And discomfort tells the other person that your boundary is still negotiable. It tells them there is emotional pressure behind your no. And if there is pressure, many people will test it. Not always because they are cruel. Often because human nature follows the path of least resistance. If pushing works, people push. If guilt works, people use guilt. If urgency works, they create urgency. This is why the quieter solution works better than the dramatic one. It changes the structure of the interaction itself. Instead of feeding the old loop, Ethan began starving it. No instant replies. No unnecessary emotional energy. No effort to make everyone feel perfectly comfortable with his limits. And when the loop is no longer rewarded, it weakens. That is basic behavioral psychology. What gets rewarded gets repeated. What stops being rewarded begins to fade. Before, Ethan had unintentionally rewarded people for treating his time as instantly available. He rewarded emotional pressure by responding faster when someone sounded stressed. He rewarded vague requests by jumping in before asking whether it was actually his problem to solve. So the behavior continued. Not because everyone around him was calculating, but because the system kept working. Once he removed the reward, he changed the system. And when the system changes, behavior changes with it. But there is another layer that matters even more. The shift was effective because it changed Ethan internally, not just externally. Every time he paused instead of reacting, he strengthened a different part of himself. The part that observes before responding. The part that notices pressure without obeying it. The part that can feel guilt without immediately trying to erase it. That may sound small, but it is the core of self-control. Most people think control means controlling others. In reality, the deepest form of control is being able to stay grounded while someone else tries to pull you into an old pattern. That is why awareness alone is not enough. You can recognize a bad dynamic and still get pulled back into it if your internal habits have not changed. Ethan's new behavior worked because it trained a new identity. Not the person who is always available. Not the person who keeps harmony at any cost. But the person who can stay calm long enough to choose. And choice is where power returns. But even with that shift, there was still one pressure point left. One hidden mechanism that explains why some people respect your boundaries immediately, while others keep testing them again and again. There was still one thing Ethan couldn't explain. Even after he slowed down, set boundaries, and stopped reacting automatically, some people adjusted immediately. They became more respectful, more aware, almost as if they had been waiting for him to change. But others didn't stop. They kept pushing, kept testing, kept trying to pull him back into the same pattern. And at first, that didn't make sense. If the system had changed, why didn't everyone respond the same way? That's when Lucas pointed out something most people completely miss. Not everyone is reacting to your behavior. Some people are reacting to your role. And that changes everything. Because once someone places you into a role in their mind, the reliable one, the helpful one, the one who always says yes, they stop seeing your individual actions. They stop evaluating each situation separately. Instead, they filter everything you do through that role. So even when you change your behavior, they don't fully register it. They assume it's temporary. They assume you'll go back. And because of that assumption, they keep testing. Not because they're confused, but because they're checking if the old version of you is still accessible. This is where most people break. They interpret that pressure as a sign they're doing something wrong. They think, maybe I'm being too harsh. Maybe I should just help this one time. And the moment they give in, even once, the old pattern snaps back into place. Because from the other person's perspective, nothing really changed. It was just a delay, a momentary resistance. And now the door is open again. But here's the twist that changes how you see everything. The people who keep testing you are not the problem. They are the proof. Proof of how you were seen before. Proof of how consistent your old pattern was. And more importantly, proof of whether your new behavior is strong enough to hold. Because real change isn't tested when things are easy. It's tested when someone applies pressure. When someone expects the old version of you to show up. When someone subtly challenges your boundary to see if it's real or just temporary. That's why this stage feels uncomfortable. Because you're not just changing your actions. You're breaking a role that other people have relied on. And when you break a role, people react. Some adapt. Some resist. Some disappear. But every reaction gives you information. More than anything they could say directly. Because words can be controlled. Reactions are harder to fake. If someone respects your boundary without pushing, they were never dependent on your old pattern. If someone pushes once and then adjusts, they're recalibrating. But if someone keeps testing, keeps applying pressure, keeps trying to make you feel guilty, that tells you something much deeper. Not just about them, but about the dynamic you were in. And this is where control either solidifies or collapses. Because maintaining a boundary once is easy. Maintaining it when someone tries to pull you back, that's where most people fail. Not because they don't understand the situation, but because they underestimate how persistent the old pattern can be. And the moment you hesitate, the moment you soften without intention, the moment you return to automatic behavior, the system resets. Quietly, completely, as if nothing ever changed. Which means the real question isn't whether you can set a boundary, it's whether you can hold it when someone expects you not to. It didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no obvious manipulation, no clear line being crossed. That's why Ethan almost missed it again. It was a Friday evening, and he had already decided he wouldn't let himself fall back into old patterns. Then his phone lit up. A message from someone he considered close. Hey, I really need your help with something. It's kind of urgent. That word, urgent, hit instantly. Not because the situation was truly critical, but because his brain had been trained to respond to it. Urgency creates pressure, and pressure creates action. Without thinking too much, Ethan felt that familiar pull, that subtle tension in his chest, that quiet voice saying, if you don't respond, something might go wrong. But this time he paused, just for a few seconds longer than usual. And in that pause, something became visible. He realized this wasn't the first urgent request. In fact, every time this person reached out, it was framed the same way. Always important. Always time-sensitive. Always needing immediate attention. But when he looked closer, none of those situations had actually been emergencies. They were just priorities for the other person. That's when he started connecting the pattern. Urgency wasn't a fact. It was a tool. A way to bypass his thinking and trigger his automatic response. And once he saw it, he noticed something else. The message wasn't just asking for help. It was structured in a way that assumed he would say yes. No real question. No space to decline. Just a smooth transition from request to expectation. That's how subtle control works. It doesn't force you. It removes the moment where you would normally decide. Then came the second layer. When Ethan didn't reply immediately, another message followed. I thought you'd understand. You're usually the one I can count on. On the surface, it sounded like appreciation, but underneath, it carried weight. It tied his identity to his response. If he helped, he stayed reliable. If he didn't, he risked breaking that image. And that's where most people give in. Not because they want to help, but because they don't want to lose how they're seen. That's the manipulation most people never notice. It doesn't attack you directly. It connects your action to your identity. So saying no feels like becoming someone else. But Ethan didn't respond right away. He waited. And in that space, the pressure became clearer. The urgency, the subtle guilt, the expectation. None of it was loud, but all of it was there. Then he replied, short, calm. I can't take this on right now. No explanation, no apology, just the boundary. And the reaction came almost instantly. Wow, I didn't expect that from you. That sentence revealed everything. Not anger, not frustration, just surprise. Because in their mind, Ethan wasn't someone who said no. And the moment he did, the illusion broke. That's when he understood something deeper. Manipulation doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like familiarity, like patterns that have been repeated so many times, they feel normal. Like expectations that were never spoken, but always assumed. And the most dangerous part is, you don't feel like you're being pushed. You feel like you're choosing. But if you step back and look closely, the same phrases appear. The same timing. The same emotional cues. And once you see that pattern, you start to realize how many times you've responded the same way, without ever questioning it. If Ethan had ignored what he just saw, nothing would have exploded overnight. That's what makes this so dangerous. There's no obvious breaking point. No single moment where everything falls apart. Instead, it keeps going quietly, subtly, and over time, the cost becomes something much bigger than a few favors or a bit of lost time. Because every time you ignore that pattern, you reinforce it. Not just in others, but in yourself. You start training your own mind to accept imbalance as normal. You start believing that relationships are supposed to feel slightly one-sided. That being drained is just part of being a good person. And once that belief sets in, you stop questioning it. That's when the real loss begins. Not in what you give, but in what you stop expecting. You stop expecting reciprocity. You stop expecting respect. You stop expecting people to consider your time, your energy, your priorities. And when you lower those expectations, people don't rise to meet them. They adjust downward. Because human behavior tends to match the standard that's set. If you act like your time is flexible, people treat it as flexible. If you act like your energy is unlimited, people assume it is. And over time, you become the person who is always available, but rarely valued. And here's the deeper consequence most people don't see coming. It starts affecting how you see yourself. You begin to measure your worth by how useful you are to others, by how often you can solve problems, be there, step in, fix things. And that might feel good at first. It gives you a sense of purpose, a sense of being needed. But that feeling is fragile, because it depends entirely on other people needing something from you. The moment they don't, or the moment you stop giving, that sense of value disappears. And when your identity is tied to being useful, you become afraid to stop, afraid to say no, afraid to step back, because it feels like losing your place, losing your role. That's how people stay trapped in this cycle for years. Not because they don't see what's happening, but because leaving the pattern feels like losing something important. But here's the reality Ethan started to understand. What you're losing by staying in that pattern is much bigger than what you think you're protecting. You're losing control over your own time, your own priorities, your own direction. Every time you say yes to something that doesn't align with you, you're saying no to something that does. And those trade-offs add up. Slowly, but consistently. You end up behind on your own goals, your own plans, your own growth. Not because you lack discipline, but because your energy is constantly being redirected. And the people benefiting from that redirection rarely think about the cost to you. Not because they're intentionally harmful, but because they don't have to. You've made it easy for them not to. That's the quiet truth behind all of this. If you don't change the pattern, it doesn't stay the same. It gets deeper, stronger, more automatic. Until one day, you look around and realize you've built a life where everyone has access to you, except yourself. And by that point, changing doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it feels disruptive. It feels like breaking something that has been stable for a long time. Even if that stability was costing you more than you realized. What Ethan realized next wasn't just another tactic. It was a shift in how he saw value itself. Because up until that point, he thought value came from what he gave. His time, his effort, his availability. But that perspective was incomplete. And that's exactly why it made him vulnerable. Lucas explained it in a way that changed everything. Value isn't what you give, it's what you don't give to everyone. At first, that didn't make sense. It sounded almost selfish. But when Ethan looked closer, he saw the pattern. The people who were respected the most weren't the ones who gave the most. They were the ones who chose carefully. They didn't respond to everything. They didn't make themselves constantly available. And because of that, their time carried weight. Not because they said it did, but because their behavior proved it. That's the first advanced principle most people miss. Scarcity creates clarity. When your time is always available, it becomes invisible. When it's limited, it becomes valuable. Not because you say no more often, but because your yes becomes intentional. And people can feel that difference immediately. But here's where it goes deeper. Ethan started noticing that the most respected people didn't just manage their time, they managed access. They didn't allow every conversation to go wherever the other person wanted. They redirected. They set the frame. If someone came in with urgency, they didn't absorb it. They slowed it down, asked questions, made the other person explain. And that small shift changed the dynamic completely. Because the moment you stop accepting someone else's frame, you create your own. That's the second principle. Control doesn't come from saying no. It comes from deciding how interactions unfold. Before, Ethan would enter every conversation ready to respond. Now, he entered ready to observe, to understand what was actually being asked. And more importantly, what was being assumed. Because most manipulation doesn't come in the form of direct requests. It comes in the form of assumptions. Assumptions that you'll help, that you'll respond, that you'll prioritize their need over your own. And if you don't challenge those assumptions, they become reality. So Ethan started doing something subtle. When someone asked for something, he didn't answer immediately. He asked a question back. What exactly do you need? Why now? What have you tried already? Not aggressively. Just enough to slow the interaction down. And something interesting happened. Some requests disappeared. Not because they weren't important, but because they were never serious to begin with. They relied on speed, not substance. That's when Ethan understood the third principle. Most pressure only works if you accept it quickly. The longer you hold it without reacting, the weaker it becomes. But here's the part that changed everything. Ethan stopped trying to be liked in every interaction. Not in a harsh way. Not by pushing people away, but by accepting that respect and comfort don't always exist at the same time. Sometimes, holding a boundary creates a moment of discomfort. And that discomfort is necessary. Because without it, nothing shifts. That's what most people avoid. They avoid the moment where things feel slightly tense, slightly uncertain. And in doing so, they keep the same dynamic alive. But once Ethan stopped avoiding that moment, something else appeared. Clarity. He could see who respected him without needing constant access, who valued him beyond what he could give, and who only stayed as long as the pattern worked. And that clarity was something he never had before. At some point, Ethan stopped seeing these situations as isolated incidents. It wasn't just about that one message, that one favor, that one person. It was a system, a pattern that had been repeating quietly across different areas of his life. And once he stepped back far enough, everything started to connect. The delayed responses, the shorter answers, the boundaries, the reactions people had, they weren't random. They were signals, each one revealing something about the dynamic he was in. And more importantly, about the role he had been playing without realizing it. Because that's the core of it. You don't get used because you're unlucky. You get used because you've been placed into a role, and you've been unconsciously maintaining it. The reliable one. The easy one. The one who adjusts. And the longer you stay in that role, the more invisible it becomes. Not just to others, but to you. You stop questioning it. You start defending it. You start believing that's just who you are. But here's the shift that changes everything. Your role is not fixed. It's reinforced. Reinforced by repetition. Reinforced by how consistently you respond the same way. Which means it can also be broken the same way. Not in one big move, but through small, consistent changes that disrupt the expectation. That's why nothing Ethan did looked dramatic from the outside. But internally, everything was different. He was no longer reacting to pressure. He was observing it. He was no longer trying to maintain an image. He was choosing his response. And that distinction, is where control returns. Because once you realize that most people are not controlling you directly, they are responding to what you allow, you stop focusing on them. You start focusing on your own patterns, your own signals, your own defaults. And that's where real leverage is. Not in trying to change people, but in changing what they can predict about you. That's why the most important question isn't, why are they doing this? It's, what have I been showing them consistently enough for this to feel normal? And that question is uncomfortable, because it removes the idea that you're just a victim of circumstance. It puts you back in the center of the dynamic. But it also gives you something most people never reach, control that doesn't depend on anyone else changing. And once Ethan saw that clearly, he stopped trying to fix interactions one by one. He started adjusting the system itself. The way he responded, the way he paced conversations, the way he handled pressure. And as those patterns changed, the people around him adjusted accordingly. Some stepped back, some stepped up, some disappeared entirely. But none of that felt confusing anymore. Because for the first time, he wasn't guessing what was happening. He was seeing it as it was. And when you can see the pattern clearly enough, you stop being part of it unconsciously. You start deciding how much access, how much time, how much energy you give without needing approval. And that's when the dynamic shifts completely. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped feeding the version of it that used to control you. By the time Ethan reached this point, he didn't need more advice. He needed a way to act differently in real moments, without overthinking, without hesitating, without slipping back into old patterns. And that's where most people fail. Not because they don't understand, but because when the situation happens, it feels too fast, too subtle, too familiar. So everything defaults back to automatic. That's why the next shift isn't about doing more. It's about doing less, but doing it intentionally. The first thing Ethan started doing was creating space before every response. Not just with messages, but with conversations, requests, even simple questions. A pause, just a few seconds longer than usual. Long enough to notice what he was feeling. Was it pressure? Was it urgency? Was it that quiet discomfort that usually pushed him to say yes? That pause became a filter, because most automatic reactions don't survive even a few seconds of awareness. Then he added something else. Instead of answering directly, he started labeling what was happening. Not out loud, but internally. This feels rushed. This sounds vague. This is assuming I'll say yes. And that simple act changed everything. Because once you can name a pattern, you're no longer inside it blindly. You're observing it. And when you observe something clearly enough, it loses part of its control over you. The next step looked even smaller, but it had a bigger impact. Ethan stopped finishing other people's sentences in his mind. Before, the moment someone started asking for something, he would already be thinking about how to help, how to solve it, how to respond. Now, he let them fully explain, fully commit to what they were asking. And in doing that, something interesting happened. Many requests became less convincing, less urgent, less reasonable. Not because they changed, but because he stopped filling in the gaps for them. That's when he introduced one simple rule. If something isn't clear, don't commit. Ask one more question. Just one. Not to challenge, but to understand. And that extra question often revealed what the first request was hiding. Whether it was urgency that wasn't real, or responsibility that wasn't his, or expectation that had never been spoken, but was always assumed. Then came the part most people avoid. Sitting with discomfort, without fixing it. When someone expected a quick yes, and didn't get it, there was a moment, a slight tension, a shift in tone. And before, Ethan would rush to smooth it out, to make things feel normal again. But now he let it stay, just for a moment longer. And in that moment, the real dynamic revealed itself. Whether the other person respected the boundary, or tried to push through it. Whether they adjusted, or applied more pressure. That reaction told him everything. More than any explanation ever could. But there was still one layer he hadn't fully unlocked yet. Something that determines not just how you respond, but how people approach you in the first place. And once that changes, most of these situations stop happening before they even begin. What Ethan began to notice after all these shifts wasn't just a change in how he responded, it was a change in how people approached him. Fewer urgent messages. Fewer vague requests. Fewer situations that felt like pressure disguised as opportunity. And at first, that felt like a coincidence. But it wasn't. Because most people don't realize this, the way others treat you is often decided before they even speak to you. It's based on what they expect will happen. If they expect you to respond instantly, they reach out casually, without thinking. If they expect you to say yes, they don't even frame it as a real question. But if they're not sure, if there's even a small chance you might pause, question, or decline, something changes. They become more careful, more respectful, more intentional. And that's the layer most people never reach. They focus on reacting better, instead of becoming harder to predict in the first place. Because once your patterns change consistently enough, people adjust before the interaction even begins. That's how real control shows up. Not in what you say, but in what others expect from you. But here's the deeper part that Ethan couldn't ignore. The more he stepped out of his old role, the more space appeared. Space in his time. Space in his thinking. Space in his energy. And in that space, something uncomfortable surfaced. He realized how much of his life had been shaped by reacting instead of choosing. How many decisions were made not because he wanted to, but because it felt easier to go along with what was expected. And that realization changed the entire perspective. Because this was never just about other people using him. It was about how often he had given up control without noticing. How often he had traded awareness for comfort. And once you see that clearly, you can't go back to not seeing it. That's why this isn't just about setting boundaries or managing conversations. It's about something much deeper. It's about recognizing the invisible agreements you've been living by. The ones you never consciously chose, but have been following anyway. Agreements like, I should always be available. Or, I shouldn't disappoint people. Or, if I don't help, something will go wrong. And once those agreements are exposed, you have a choice. Not a loud, dramatic choice, but a quiet one. In each moment. In each interaction. To either continue the pattern or shift it. And the shift doesn't always feel powerful at first. Sometimes it feels uncertain, slightly uncomfortable, even wrong. But over time, that discomfort becomes clarity. And that clarity becomes control. Not control over others, but control over how you show up, how you respond, and how much of yourself you give away without thinking. And that's where everything changes. Because once you stop operating on automatic, once you stop reacting to pressure without questioning it, once you start choosing instead of defaulting, the entire dynamic of your life begins to reorganize around that awareness. But here's the question that most people avoid, and the one that determines whether anything actually changes for you. If you look at your last few interactions, how many of them were truly your choice? And how many of them were just a response to what you've trained others to expect from you?